Obviously, I want to talk about dictators. And I think a lot of us are fascinated by these guys. I think they're pretty much always guys, so I don't feel the need to make it gender. There's no gender equality here. I think it's like 99% of dictators or 100% of dictators are guys, at least right now. Actually, is that true? Before I throw that down.
Well, it really depends upon how you want to define a dictator. I always think of everything as in shades of political institutions. How accountable are you? So dictators are clearly on the spectrum of not being accountable to too many people. I'm struggling to think of female dictators at the moment.
Yeah,
but so let's go with them.
Let's
go with them mainly men.
That's good enough for me. So it's almost always guys. Okay, fine, but it's a bit confusing for a lot of us about why people put up with them. I mean, their bad behavior goes unchecked for so long. Why is bad behavior so often good politics?
The key to the way we think about politics is to think about how many people do you need to keep happy in order to stay in power. And the reality is most dictators rely on relatively few people, and they're obviously nested, generally in hierarchies. And often in dictatorial systems, let's think of North Korea as the archetypal system, you rely on handfuls of people at the top, maybe 100 people at the top, and those people have supporters immediately below them. But the numbers are very, very small. And the people of North Korea are miserable, but as a practical matter, it's virtually impossible for them to rise up and bring the leader down. So they're miserably unhappy, but there's almost nothing they can do. We go to the other extreme, democracies. People are pretty happy and they don't really want to rebel because we get healthcare, we get public education, law and order. It's the middle between those extremes that we actually find people rising up.
Hey, speak for yourself. I'm in the United States. We don't get healthcare. I mean, it's available if you have enough money, but this is not the UK, buddy. Step back.
Well, I mean, I'm in Toronto at the moment, so I guess I can rely on the Ontario healthcare.
What do you think this is, Canada? No, I understand what you're saying, though. Yeah. It's not. I've been to North Korea, and they can't talk about things. They can't drive. You can't just hop in the car that you don't have, that you can't buy, and go to another town. You need permits to visit relatives. You need permission to literally do pretty much anything. Restaurants are completely empty most of the time. Occasionally you'll see one or two people in there, an official smoking with another official. You don't see families with kids eating at the pizza place, the one pizza place in Pyongyang. You just don't. And we can get into some of that in a bit, just because you're right. North Korea just seems to be, that's like dictator gold medal Olympics, where everything has failed and everything is under strict control. It seems very unusual, though. People who hear I went to North Korea, they'll eventually ask me something like, why don't they just kill Kim Jong-Un? He's just one guy. Or Saudi Arabia, why don't they just get rid of Mohammed bin Salman, MBS? Why don't they just get rid of him? And I think it's hard for a lot of us to understand that it's not just one guy governing alone who sleeps with a gun under his pillow. There are coalitions around these people. They pick the king that they can control. It's not that he's the toughest guy, right? Kim Jong-un, hardly a specimen of masculinity that has the army wrapped around his finger. It's more like the other way around, probably.
Well, you say that you're talking about who picks who. There's a really interesting symbiosis that develops as leaders come to power. So think about Kim when he came to power. To get to succeed from his father, he needed the support of a lot of the key insiders that were there. Particularly, I'm thinking of Uncle Tech is probably the guy you've heard of, who he ends up killing about 3 or 4 years later with a anti-aircraft gun in a particularly horrific way. But this is actually the reason why people don't want to get rid of established dictators. You've survived long enough that the dictator is going to keep you in power. And if you're in North Korea, the elites actually, in material terms, have a fairly high standard of living. They get access to imported goods and everything. The real problem goes if you get rid of that leader and you bring somebody in, but without completely reforming the system. And it's unlikely you can go from that kind of limited autocracy all the way to democracy in one step. You've got to think about what's your chances of surviving to be one of the privileged ones under the new regime. So you might hate Kim, but Kim's keeping you fat and happy. And the average person in North Korea is poor, miserable, isolated, ignorant, just because that's the way the government keeps people under control. And so you've got this lottery. It's like the guy here is keeping me happy. The next guy I might be killed. There's a good chance I won't be in this position. I'll be in a gulag or just some rural village. And so it's this lottery, this risk of being replaced under the new leadership, that this churn of who are the elites when a new dictator comes in that keeps people loyal.
When I lived in Serbia, former Yugoslavia, this is like 20 years ago, I remember asking my boss, why, what was the deal with Slobodan Milosevic? And she said, oh, he was a bastard, but it's better the devil you know. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, my boss was kind of a Serbian nationalist, so she wasn't, more on the right-wing spectrum of like, get rid of anybody who's not Serbian in my country, that kind of thing, which is funny because she hired me and I'm an American, and she really, I never heard the end of that, but that's a whole nother, that's a whole weird story. But the idea that this bastard that she kind of thought was a piece of crap, at least in her mind, she's like, at least we don't have Muslims invading us, and the Albanians are being kept at bay, and the Bosnians aren't trying to take over our territory, and we're using our military to push these people out and get rid of our domestic enemies. She wasn't like, he's the greatest thing ever. She was just like, yeah, he's a piece of crap, but he's our piece of crap kind of thing.
Yeah, that's exactly the lottery. You might not like the guy, you might not do good things, you might go hungry sometimes, the water doesn't run, the electric goes out all the time. But it's better than having the same shitty policies with someone of a different group where nothing is going to flow to you. And so you get stuck with the shitty policies and none of the sort of goods that are rewarding you, which sounds for your boss, sort of immigration policies.
Sure, right.
That she
cared about. It was even more than that, because it was, if you live not in Belgrade and you live on a border with Croatia or Bosnia, if we don't have this guy defending us, right, Milosevic, and North Korea has this same sort of narrative where, but for Kim Jong-Un and the Kim dynasty, the U.S. and their cronies in South Korea are going to rush in there and slaughter everyone, just like they did in the Korean War or whatever. And that's what people are afraid of. And little do they know that mostly we would just come in there with bags full of money and infrastructure and expertise and rebuild the place at our own expense. That's not the narrative they're saying. And with Serbia, back then, as far as the nationalists, the right wingers, they were saying, hey, if you live on the border or you got family or friends on the border of Bosnia, if we don't have this guy, then they're going to run in there, slaughter everybody in that village, take the house or burn it down, and it's going to be a genocide. And they're not totally wrong. I mean, that's what happened during that civil war. And so the stakes are really high, even if for a place like North Korea, the stakes are mostly just imaginary because of propaganda.
Yeah, I think you don't even really need to have that story that the US and South Korea will rush in. I suspect that the elites realize that might, for the average person in the country, be quite a good thing. It's the chance that trying to get rid of the leader, you might not succeed and you're definitely going to suffer. And you won't be a material elite if South Korea took over. I mean, it's an interesting question to think about the elites in South Korea and the elites in North Korea. So let's say there's 100 elites in North Korea who, let's say, have an income of $250,000 equivalent, right? Which is a pretty wealthy system. Or you could be a person who the government favors in South Korea and you live on, let's say, $80,000 a year. But you can also say whatever you like, travel wherever you want, whenever you want, without getting any kind of permit or anything. But you've got to think what happens when there's leader change in North Korea versus what happens leader change in South Korea. So the recent election, we moved from sort of the right, and we had Moon as the left, and now we're back towards the right. But for the average South Korean citizen, life has not changed very much because nearly everything in that system is devoted to protecting the people from weather, having law and order, protecting them from the North Koreans, healthcare, infrastructure. And so all of those things change very little. We can think of, in the United States in the last decade, we've seen some what most Americans would perceive as radical changes from sort of Obama to Trump and back to Obama. But I suspect for most of us, it's had, there are many things we could argue on either side about which was better or whatever, but on a material basis, it's had almost no effect on our lives, almost no effect on the regulation we have.
That makes sense, right? You're still an attorney at whatever law firm you're at, whether it's Obama or Trump, and you can still go on your vacation. You don't lose your home. There's not your city doesn't burn down or get shelled by a rebel militia, depending on who gets elected. Although that could change.
Right. So you made a sort of important distinction here. So in the US, we earn money, and it's our money. We put it in a bank, and it's going to be safe for us to use there. If you were to live in North Korea or under the Soviet Union or any dictatorial system, really, the thing is, it's not that you have stuff. It's just that you're given access to stuff, and that access can be taken away. And that's why people stay loyal, because this access is a symbiotic relationship. You have the leader gives it to you, and you support the leader. You can't do without each other. As you said earlier, the leader can't, even the most dictatorial person cannot rule by themselves. And so they have to have supporters, and these supporters have to be rewarded. But it's the key that the rewards get taken away. So you get given a dacha on a beautiful Black Sea resort, let's say, under the Soviet system. But that gets taken away if the leader doesn't want you there anymore, or if you show any disloyalty. And that's a difference. It's sort of the money. You and I have 401ks. You don't have those in dictatorial systems.
So supporters are loyal, but probably only loyal until it's more lucrative / stable or beneficial to be loyal to somebody else. Or it's dangerous to be loyal to you because you're dying. And we'll talk about that in a bit, right? So it's the backs that need to scratch. They might change, but that's maybe about it.
Yeah, that's right. I think in small coalition systems, I think where leaders are beholden to relatively small numbers of supporters to stay in power, the sort of ideological differences we talk about in a democracy, are you a left winger, a right winger, personal freedoms, blah, those the sort of left right, it's all a shell. It's just basically the leader transfers wealth and resources to their supporters, or allows them to steal it for themselves through corruption and graft. But they permit them to do this, and in exchange they keep the leader there. And it's that symbiotic relationship that keeps everybody happy.
Right.
It keeps only the elites happy.
I was going to say,
the people are miserable.
Everybody
the people are miserable.
Everybody in the group of 500 who's not right. The generals and the tycoons.
But what I'm going to say is everybody that matters.
Everybody
for the
that matters.
vast majority of cases, it's not about what the people want. It's true. It's what the people want in places like the United States. We can be politically very disloyal. You could vote Republican one time, Democrat the other. Whoever wins, whoever you supported, it's not going to affect your welfare. We don't, in the United States or other Western Europe, or we don't go after people as a basis of that they voted differently or they advocated for the losing candidate.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to be somebody who if they even do this in Cuba, you wouldn't want to be the person who says, you know what, I'm sick of this Castro guy is really busting my balls. I'm sick of him. You definitely wouldn't want to say that publicly, I would imagine. And in places like Russia, you see what happens to dissidents, like as long as they have any sort of public profile, and even anti-war protesters, a lot of those people are in prison for a long time for standing there with a sign. And we'll get to some of that in a minute. A helpful concept, though, from the book is the nominal versus the real selectorate. So who really chooses who gets power? We kind of touched on this. I'd love to talk about the United States versus North Korean versions of this, because it is kind of confusing, because there's arguments in the United States we have elites too, and they're the ones who are really in charge. And some of that's true, but some of it's a conspiracy theory. When you look at North Korea, it's not a theory. right? It's not a conspiracy theory. It really is a small group of people who are in charge, and everybody knows that.
Right. So we could do the maths real quickly for the US. So, what are we, 350 million people in the United States, something in that ballpark. So, there's at least there's 250 million voters, because I'm not a citizen. People are less than 18, but we've got 250 million voters, but how many of them really matter? All you got to do is win half the seats in half the districts. This is sort of the classic parliamentary two-party system. You don't care about, in districts that you won, you don't care about having any more than one vote more than the opposition. So, you see, only need a quarter of the votes. The best case scenario, you need a quarter of the votes that are cast, because just split it up. The US is even worse because the seats are handed out by state, and so the number of votes you need in Wyoming to win a seat is really tiny. It is much tinier than the same number of votes you need to win a seat in California and New York, and the states contribute to the Electoral College. So if you do the maths, you can get down to comfortably winning the presidency and the House with something like 22, 23 million votes, which is, we're talking 10%
Not even
of the number of voters that there are. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But that is an enormous number when you compare that to, let's say, 100 or 1,000 people in Korea or any other dictatorial system that you want. So the policies that keep millions of people happy are very different from the policies that keep 100 people happy. And that's the quintessential difference. Yes, the US is in many ways corrupt, and there's gerrymandering, and there's the Electoral College, and these make the coalition smaller than you would expect. You'd expect a democracy, direct election for the president, half the votes. But it's much smaller than that, but it's still enormous. That doesn't mean we can't improve it. Getting rid of the Electoral College would really help. But we got to think it's almost impossible to get rid of it. It's a difficult problem because the states that really matter, the presidents write policies to win votes in, let's say, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, because he doesn't care. The people running for president, they don't really care about New York or California or Wyoming, because we sort of know where those votes are going to go. So all we do is the president is directing policy to enhance the welfare of people that support him in Pennsylvania. Or I just take an example.
Sure, Iowa.
And that's a much smaller
swing states,
yeah,
right?
Iowa.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just so much as if we change the electoral rule, we'd have got a different outcome. It's if you change the electoral rule, the policy incentives of leaders disappear. So that I know people go, it's sort of unfair that a few states get to end up picking the president. But the reality is that affects policy for all of us, because the policies are targeted to making those states better off. So we saw all the sort of protectionism that we saw under Trump. Most of the benefits of those trade restrictions went to benefit. They were, in fact, in some sense, private goods, private rewards that disproportionately benefited people in key electoral states.
And that's something that's been going on for a long time. I just want to be clear so people aren't like, he doesn't like Trump. It's like, this has been the beginning of time in America, the beginning of our electoral system. We've had this problem. It's pork barrel politics.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just thinking of trade, which is why I was just thinking of a recent targeted policy. Trump is no different from anybody else. Barack Obama had his supporters that kept him in power, and he made them happy. And Joe Biden is doing things to help left-leaning voters in the area. I mean, we think about Democrats and Republicans and sort of this ideologically left and ideologically right. I tend to think of, I don't find those distinctions especially useful. The Republicans take money from Democrats by reducing welfare and services and give them to their supporters in the form of tax cuts. And when the Democrats come in, they want to tax more highly so they can take it from the rich who don't vote for them disproportionately and give it to poor people on the margin who are going to vote for them. People who don't vote, groups of voters, like the homeless, for example, people do relatively little for them because they're not important in terms of the electoral base.
Yeah, that's sort of the sad truth of any system, right? Or at least any system that's not direct democracy without gerrymandering, that in absolute sort of population level. I mean, even then, it's really hard to get people who are at the bottom of the societal hierarchy to have enough power to do anything. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about why do leaders do anything to deal with homelessness, it's disproportionately done because people experience the sort of follow-on impacts of having homeless people living on the streets and, occupying public parks. And that's much more the reason that politicians will do something about the homeless situation. And disproportionately, they like to move it to another city, right? Nobody wants to offer great homeless services because, it's expensive and then more homeless people will be there. And so that's not the response. It's just, how do I insulate my political supporters from being poorly impacted by this social problem?
Yeah, that's the sad part of this is, of course, that means we literally treat these people like garbage. Hey, get these people off my street. I want my kids to play here. There's people there. There's needles there or whatever. There's in San Francisco, there's human waste there, whatever it is. And it's not, man, we really need to help these people. I mean, some of us think that way, but what the politicians and voters are normally thinking is, can't we put these people on a bus and ship them to, and then just fill in the blank of another state? And we do this all the time. And I'm not talking about recent political stunts with migrants or anything. I'm talking about literally taking homeless folks that maybe get arrested, putting them on a bus and saying, don't get off until you're in California or Florida or some other place that's not whatever state they happen to be in at the time.
Yeah, a bus ticket is a really cheap way of fixing a problem as opposed to fixing the underlying problem. But politicians want to look good to their voters. Politicians aren't rewarded for fixing social problems. They're rewarded by staying in office, which means keeping the people they care about happy, not keeping, doing the right thing is not always helpful.
No. I mean, I don't think anybody's going to go, I don't think anybody's under the illusion that politicians are sort of hell-bent on doing the right thing most of the time. And that's the sad joke about the political system, especially in the United States, is that it's not actually about representing their constituents in many cases. And I'm not talking about every politician, especially the local folks. They're super interested in helping people in their corner of the city or whatever on city council. But once you get to the national level, it's just, you'd have to really convince me that somebody's a national level politician gives a crap about people in every part of the country equally. It doesn't make any sense. It's unlikely. It seems impossible, and it's frankly not what we see from their actions.
Well, let's be generous. Let's suppose you are really a publicly spirited person, and you do care about the welfare of everyone. The point is, if you try and make everybody happy, and the other guy is trying to make a quarter of the people happy, he can make that quarter happier than you can make everybody.
And they're the quarter that matters, right?
And if that's the quarter that matters, you've got to. So even if you wanted to fix if you really cared deeply about having policy solutions that helped everybody, you enact them, you won't be in power. And that's the sad reality is, I suspect many politicians go into being political leaders with this motivation that they want to be helpful, but they realize that to continue their career, they have to pick who they're going to reward and who they're not.
I'd love to know why there are so many people living in poverty in dictatorships. I know we just sort of railed on democracy there, and that's an appropriate tangent, but and by the way, by no means am I saying that democracies don't have poor people. We just kind of covered that, but dictatorships, they almost seem to just specialize in manufacturing a huge amount of poor people.
Right. That's precisely right. The policies in a dictatorship are designed to enrich the leader and their small bunch of cronies at the top of the system. So, if you're, I'm going to say taxing, but effectively capturing the resources of society and funneling them towards your cronies, you're not providing incentives for people to work hard. Because if you work hard, you work hard, you're not a political insider, some politician's just going to decide you have something nice they want and they'll come take it. They'll lock you up for some crime, or maybe they'll just take it. So they're very unproductive societies in the whole. you don't want to let people talk to each other. You don't want let people gather, because people might get together and talk about what a terrible leader you are. So you want to keep people isolated. You want to keep them educated just enough to carry out the minimal standards that you need for perhaps agriculture or low-grade manufacturing. You don't want them to give them free speech. And, the extent that, you want to give them basic healthcare, because healthy workers can work and the sickly can't. So, basic low-grade education, basic healthcare are things that dictators aren't opposed to, because it keeps a workforce there. But things like freedoms, societies are very unproductive. People can't talk to each other. What they make gets taken away. And that's why they stay poor. The situation becomes even worse when the leader doesn't even really need the people to work to generate revenue. So, we think of the United States, we think about, we work, the government take a share of it, and then they can use that to provide policies that enrich their supporters. Oil-rich states, they don't have to do any of that, because they can completely cut the average person who lives in that country out, because they don't even rely on that person's productive labor to generate revenues. So,
I want to dive deeper down that rabbit hole in a second, but I want to sort of review this here, because it's a really interesting point that people in autocracies or dictatorships, I'm just going to use those terms interchangeably here for the rest of the show. There's no point in working hard, and that's probably one of the main reasons why we see things like brain drain from a place like Russia or to a certain extent China and other places, because and I've heard this about Russia so many times, if you and I are living in Russia and we start a business and the business is successful, if somebody finds out about that, they're well connected, you and I end up in jail for corruption. Or let's say I'm better connected than you. You start a business with me and you need my connections. And one day I go, I'm just going to take this. I go to my crony friend and I say, Alastair he wants half my money, and you should investigate him for jaywalking, something. And you end up in prison for 20 years for whatever reason. And I just take the business. And that's the end. And so eventually, when everybody finds out about this, I say, I would like to start a business with you. Let's go to Canada and do it, where I don't have to worry about the rule of law being up to the whims of your uncle who works for the Communist Party or works for Putin's friend. And we can actually start a real business over there. And you might opt out of that, but I'm gone. I'm out of here. I don't want to do business in there.
Yeah, perfect. Couldn't agree more. Perfect example. And, when we see people in such places as China and Russia who have the option of getting money overseas, we see these real estate bubbles in London and Vancouver and places like this. And they're basically funneled that if you could get 50 cents on the dollar out of the country where it's yours and it's safe and it's hard for the government to claw it back, then that's the reality. You want to move your wealth offshore and be productive elsewhere.
I did a show about Chinese money laundering in Canada with a journalist. Hold on, I got to look up the episode number so we can say it. That was episode 677. I did a show about money laundering from China to Canada and real estate. And essentially what this guy had uncovered, he's a journalist, what he had uncovered is people will take money and put it in a Chinese bank, and then essentially gangster mafia type organized crime will then take money in Canada and give it to that person, but they take a massive commission. It's probably like 20%, but you don't care because you don't want your $2 million in Beijing anymore. You already have $10 million in currency there, and it could go away at any time. What you want are 4 homes in Vancouver. And so you just get those even though you pay a massive commission, but at least then you're not going to be poor and possibly in prison if something changes.
We could point to a bunch of oligarchs who were massively rich in Russia and same in China, and I'm blanking on the name completely. They just had a slight run-in with the government.
You thinking of Jack Ma?
Yeah, and I'm completely blanking on the Russian guy who ran the oil company.
Oh, Khodorkovsky?
Slightly, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Got slightly annoyed the government. Suddenly he goes to jail forever. Of course, you can find some corruption on somebody. It's a corrupt system, so business is corrupt, and that they they raised any issue, they went to jail. It's not surprising they don't want to raise their head above the parapet in terms of accumulating lots of wealth without connections or just saying anything at the top. So it's hard to coordinate against a political leader when you can't hold political rallies.
Jack Ma, to your point, Jack Ma, who founded Alibaba in China, he said, I can't even remember exactly what it was, but it was something like, yeah, we need to reform and we need more free market something, among other things. And then he just vanished for a few months. And then I believe they broke up a couple of his businesses and put them under control of other, something antitrust, basically. And now he's very quiet. Very, very quiet. And he doesn't have that social media celebrity. I mean, he was kind of almost like an Elon Musk figure in China. And that just went away overnight. And like I said, he was vanished for a few months. People thought maybe he was in prison, and he came back and he's like, nope, I was just on vacation. By the way, I'm not using any social media or going on television anymore. Bye. And that was that.
And he didn't have much of, I suspect he didn't have much of a suntan when he came back from his vacation.
That's true. No, I don't think so. I think he may have lost a little bit of weight for another reason. And in the book, you're very clear about these 5 basic rules for political survival. 1, keep your winning or insider coalition as small as possible. 2, keep your nominal selectorate, so like the interchangeables, the disposables, maybe as large as possible. 3, control the flow of revenue, so control who eats. 4, pay your key supporters just enough to keep them loyal, but not more, because, you need that money for other things. And also, why make somebody more wealthy than somebody else? That's going to cause you a problem. And 5, don't take money out of your supporters' pockets to help the poor or other pesky, needy groups. Pay those generals and those police colonels and those other politicians and tycoons as much money as possible. Hungry people don't have the energy to overthrow you, but an underpaid crony often will. So that's a kind of a decent review of some of the stuff we've touched on so far. And I think it's fascinating and depressing, but that's why dictatorships are so damn fascinating, right? So damn interesting.
Well, we could pretend that it's, the problems is moral failings of political leaders. And I just don't believe that that's the case. I think that given the circumstances, people are doing what's the best they can. And as you just pointed out, even if you want to do the right thing, you want to improve the average welfare of the citizens. If you do so at the expense of your cronies, you're going to end up dead. I mean, I think the classic example of that is Julius Caesar. The guy's brilliant, genius of his time. He does all kinds of important reforms, fixes the calendar, gets trade up and running. He's stabilized the empire. But what does he do? He's worried that a lot of Romans basically sold themselves into slavery because they couldn't pay debts that were incurred while they were off fighting the wars. And he thinks this is terrible that ordinary people who did the right thing are now being turned into slaves. What he failed to account for was the people who owned the debt turned out to be the senators. And when he started taking their wealth away, they figured it would be better to put a knife in him than it would be to allow the policy change that was literally taking, the people were coming into slavery to settle debts. And it's a great example. And they portray him as being this guy who sought to be king. The guy's clearly already dictator and king and emperor and anything else you want to say. His mistake was he wanted to do the right thing.
Huh. I hadn't thought about that. That's very interesting historical example. I mean, everybody knows the sort of famous line when he's getting stabbed, but my knowledge of him is a little bit weak. That's an interesting point, though, as well, because a dictator will often keep something like a terminal illness a secret. Now, getting stabbed by your brother is probably not a terminal illness in your definition here, but dead leaders can't provide benefits to cronies. And so we see leaders like, I think it was the Shah of Iran, and also there's probably a bunch of
79.
Yeah.
He was very sick. So there have been other times where people had gone onto the street to protest the Shah, and the military show up and shoot them, or a few of them, and the rest of them scatter. So the difference in 79 was, think of it from the military's perspective. People are protesting on the street. This guy who's selected to make you fabulously wealthy, very corrupt regime. I mean, it was pro-Western, so, we tend to have a better feeling towards that because we tend to think of democracy and good governance as people that we like as opposed to objective standards of what the institutions are.
Right.
That's another conversation. But yeah, the Shah's sick. The military are like, you want me to go shoot those people who could be my boss tomorrow.
Right.
And so they realize that the gravy train is over with the Shah because he's going to be dead. There's nothing he can do. And the next guy, it's very difficult to promise the continued flow of goodies, and so people desert. And things collapse very quickly. In Zaire, when Mobutu Sese Seko had the same problem, he was known to have, I think it was testicular cancer or prostate cancer, one of those. And he came off the plane doddery, and just basically his armed forces allow rebels to march 1,000 miles across the country and depose him, and nobody stood up to him. And actually, it's a slightly different example, but I think that a simple way to explain what happened to the fall of the Afghan government to the Taliban as the US are leaving is exactly the same. None of those units fought to keep the Taliban at bay because they realize without the US backing, the Taliban are going to be the bosses next. There's no way this government's going to hold up. Why do I want to be the one who gets killed, try to shoot the person who's going to almost certainly be my boss tomorrow? Much better to be complicit with them coming to power and hope that you'll get a good position in the new government rather than stand up for a regime that's clearly dead. And we saw how quickly that unraveled. The synergy between I am getting corrupt payments from the leadership and I have this enhanced lifestyle. And the moment you see the end of that, all the loyalty goes. And we see, we often see precipitous collapses come about. The Shah went down quickly. The same argument could be very much true for Marcos in the Philippines. We see these things happen. And that's why, the biggest state secret is how sick somebody is. You see lots of speculation about Putin for precisely the reason. A quicker way to undermine Putin is to know he's or at least his elites believe him to be terminally ill. Would be a much quicker way than having the people rise up.
It makes me wonder, and I probably just read too much crap on the internet and listen to too many damn podcasts, but it makes me wonder if, okay, so is Putin sick, or is the United States and Western allies saying, if we just talk about how we think maybe he's sick enough, then enough elites will go, God, everybody thinks he's sick. Maybe he's sick. And then maybe he falls out of a window while tied to a chair.
Yeah, exactly. If his supporters believe that he's on the way out, they'll be more than happy to push in order to enhance their own status. But, we have to think that they're fairly circumspect about the evidence that comes out from the United States media about whether he's sick.
Sure.
So it's, if I'm saying something that's advantageous to me, you should never really believe that. If I tell you something that harms my welfare and interests, then that's something believable from a politician. But they of course don't say those things very often.
I suppose that's true. Yeah. Although, who knows? You're right. If we put it in the New York Times, it's not really something that the everyday Russian is going to go, maybe we should probably believe this, because they've been reading enough articles that are kind of contrary to their own interests that maybe there's not a lot of credibility there. But it does sort of make sense that this is why the North Korea secession process is always so sudden and secret. I mean, I remember when Kim Jong-il died, it was like Kim Jong-Un, the current leader, he had come out of nowhere just a few months prior to that. I mean, Kim Jong-il must have been, they must have just said, you are going to die and it could happen kind of any minute now. You got to find a successor. And he shifted things around. This kid who was, I think he was 27 at the time, suddenly becomes the top general in the military overnight. Nobody even knew he existed, including a lot of top people in North Korea. And then he's the leader suddenly. And that's it really seems sudden. If you are paying attention to U.S. politics, you see that somebody who's a senator becomes generally, I mean, current politicians may be an exception here, reality star, whatever, but you see somebody who's a senator and has been a senator for a really, really long time, they run for president and they win. It's not some random guy that you've never seen in your life. It doesn't have a Facebook profile, right? Who runs for president and suddenly wins. So the secession process is secret, probably because they don't want people to know that the leader is sick, because it could face a challenge. You kind of just want to find out he's dead. Oh, but this other guy is already very firmly entrenched with the interest, and he's going to continue to keep the elites in power, so nobody worry, and certainly nobody run around looking for who's in charge, because it's going to be this guy.
Yeah, I think you made an important point there about dynastic succession, which is very common, not just in places like North Korea, but just think of how many times the presidents had the same surname, right? We've got two Adamses, two Bushes, we nearly had two Clintons. We see dynastic succession. And one of the logic for it, and the reason why the senators are sort of name brand people, is potential supporters realize what interests they have. And, in the dynastic setting, it's sort of, think of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree type logic. It's, the father's dying, well, the son's grown up around the palace. We know him since a child. There's a better chance that he's going to keep us around than if we went out into the population in general and picked somebody else, which is why the supporters actually sort of will support this dynastic transition, because it enhances the chance that they're going to remain in this inner circle. It's good from the leader's perspective, because the coalition become more reassured and less likely to move against the leader as they become sick. But it sort of does have the obvious problem that Crown Prince sometimes pushes the king off the throne before they're ready. So those are sort of the factors. But it's really interesting when you start counting up dynastic succession. For one of my colleagues, Pablo Quiros, he spends all his time looking at proper nouns in the Philippines, because we see just dynastic trends in which villages support which people. And it's sort of the idea that you know what you're getting.
Hey, if you like what you're hearing and seeing, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There's a lot more just like this. You can find the Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, back to the show. So back to the money issue, because a lot of this really comes down to money, who's getting paid, who's eating, right, and favors. If it's all about keeping your cronies paid, then it seems like you better never run out of cash. And you mentioned in the book, The Fall of the Czar of Russia, something with the vodka tax. I thought this was fascinating, because this was one of those, like, how did you mess this up kind of moments. And also taking away Russians' vodka seems like a really bad idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, it turns out a major revenue source in under Tsarist Russia was tax on vodka, because it's a product that's easy to tax. Because the distillery, you go there, you get the money as the vodka leaves. So it was a stable revenue source. Again, the Shah made a key mistake. The people guarding him at the Winter Palace, he told them, "You guys are going to go to the front and fight Germans next week." He's taking away the privileged position that these people had hanging around the Winter Palace. And so what do? They were like, well, we're not going to protect you from the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. What? You're not doing anything for us anymore. He took away rewards. I think it's as simple as that. If you don't pay the right people, they won't protect you anymore. So that's how I think of the Russia case. We could think of it as big social movements and the proletariat rising up. I just think of it as there were a lot of unhappy people, and you were paying the guards, you were paying the people to keep you safe from the people, the soldiers, and then all of a sudden you tell them that their lives are about to get a lot worse. They're like, I'm not doing this job anymore.
No, it seems very simple, and it seems like he should have known that. But maybe, I don't know, maybe somebody grew up in that position, was not thinking a lot about politics, and was just thinking about their own interests. Depends on how many generations. I guess it depends on how well educated the Tsar was at that point. But
yeah, I don't think you have to have good policy ideas in a small coalition system where you're not beholden to many people. He was beholden to aristocrats in the Russian system, and to a certain extent, elite generals and cabinet members. You don't have to have good policy ideas. You can stay in power with terrible ideas. If you're a US president and you have terrible ideas, you get deposed. You have to produce good policy that delivers for the American people. Same across Western Europe. So it's a battle for good ideas. So I don't think it's select mistakes for being intelligent and having a good sense of public policy, which, people make mistakes. They probably, people do make mistakes, but you don't select on good ideas. We just see, I sort of want to bring this up because it's sort of a little pet peeve of mine at the moment, is everyone talks about how great China is doing relative to the United States. It's growing and it could put in infrastructure and roads and build COVID hospitals overnight practically, and as if it's so great. I think the more important lesson to think here is go back to 1900. China and the US had about the same per capita GDP. The US dwarfs China on a per capita GDP. It's certainly growing fast now, but it also contracted massively under the same structure of political control that we have now. Mao had just awful ideas, just terrible public policy, collectivization, his little book with ideas. They were just terrible policies. Deng came in and did a good job, but I don't want to live in a country where I have to rely on the fact that I get lucky, that I get a relatively publicly spirited person who has good policy ideas, as opposed to someone who desperately works as hard as they can to do the best public policy they can, because they're not going to keep their job at the next election if they don't. That's my pet peeve at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone keeps telling me China's so great. I'm like, I want to see what's going to happen when it comes down to Xi has to decide, do I keep the economy expanding and risk losing political power, or do I clamp down the economy and shut things down? And I think to a large extent, he's going to choose option B.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that even now. And I do tons of shows about China. I'm sure you've seen some in the feed. And a lot of people who listen to the show are going to look through my feed and go, wow, there's a lot on China, and how it clamps down, and how it's really easy to look like you're doing a whole lot if you don't have any accountability and you control the media and you don't have to give any sort of human rights, a thought to human rights and things like that. It's really easy to zoom in on one little thing and go, look how fast they built that COVID hospital, and then ignore all of the other things that are going on that allow somebody to do something like that. Now, can we learn how to build quickly and do things better here in the United States or in the West? Of course we can. But I wouldn't trade what we have here for the idea that you could get arbitrarily tapped on your phone as an unhealthy person and then quarantined in a leaky roof hospital that was built in 3 days for 3 months, can't go to work, can't see your family, might die in there, might get COVID in there if you don't already have it. I mean, don't even get me started, basically. But back to the money idea. Running out of money, as you mentioned, it's not a problem when you got a bunch of oil, you got a bunch of diamonds, gold, whatever, other cobalt, natural resources. So it makes sense that dictators and autocrats and monarchs, they just last a lot longer in the Middle East or places where there's other resources, Africa versus elsewhere, where they might run out of money for another reason, like plundering and mismanaging their economy.
Yep, I think you're precisely right. I'm opposed to foreign aid very much because I think that it enables leaders to prop up their regimes for a longer time because they're less beholden to the people because they don't have to generate revenue.
That's another thing I want to talk about.
My kids just tell me I'm a grumpy old man, but I which is probably also true.
That could also be true. Yeah, it's not mutually exclusive.
But yeah, you run out of money. What I find fascinating is debt. I mean, we just allow countries to become indebted, and then we basically being in debt, as you just made the point. I don't think of it as a financial problem. I think it's a political problem. A leader that has to start taxing their own supporters or giving their supporters less so that they can make debt repayment, that's a political problem. They have to make reform. And so the standard sort of idealized way this happens is the leader says, yeah, we'll make all these reforms, but we're really desperate for money. So can you write off our debt and then we can fix all these problems? And of course, the moment the leader's not under this pressure of not having money to pay supporters, they just go, well, we can't really do that now. And it all gets forgotten. Much better. I've always thought it much better. It's like, if you actually change institutions, you set up a competitive electoral system, then I'd feel much more willing to actually give you the money ex post. I think it would be great if I think we'd my sort of pipe dream is we have sort of an escrow account, right? It's like you fix this, whether it's an infrastructure problem or an institutional reform problem. If you fix this, then the money's sitting in the bank as soon as it's, we'll send in someone to check the workmanship, and if it's done, we'll release the money. At the moment, we tend to give people money or debt relief on the promise that they'll do good things with it. But of course, we give people money to fix problems. Why would they actually want to fix the problem? Because next time round, if the problem's fixed, we're not going to give them any more money.
Right.
I mean, it's particularly a problem with natural disasters, right? You're going to build a dike. We gave you the money for the dike. You didn't build the dike. The place flooded. We gave you money for relief and more money to build the dike that you're, again, not going to build.
Right, because if I build the dike, then I don't have the same problem next time, and I can't bilk people for. I look at this and I see some of these countries that constantly have floods or constantly have crazy earthquakes and disasters, and it's like, how does this keep happening? Well, because they don't care if a bunch of poor people die because they don't have any power. The winning coalition knows that there's a big storm coming, so they take their plane, they fly to Miami, and they stay there for a month in their other house. And they don't go back until things are kind of rebuilt, or they never go back. What do they care? They're the people who are in power. They have all the money. Doesn't matter if 100,000 people die in a big earthquake or a flood or a pandemic. It just doesn't matter. Those people are largely irrelevant. In fact, maybe more dead people who are disaffected is even better, because now they can't fight. They're trying to survive by eating birds and stuff that they find in the woods. I mean, it's depressing, right? It's just sort of less people to be upset with your government at that point.
Right. I mean, we've had technology to eliminate famine for thousands of years. The pharaohs were doing it. Technology's not hard, right? You store some food and then you take it to the areas that are affected by a drought. And yet we still see droughts. We still see famines occurring because governments allow them to happen, and it's advantageous for them to happen. It always depresses me when I always show my students bits of like the Live Aid concert and the sort of underlying reason why this was done, and then sort of and you just see that the government actually basically engineered that famine. It was convenient because there were rebels in the area, and so we're just going to suck them dry, let them die. Oh, and then people in the West are seeing this terrible suffering, send money, which the government used to buy trucks to forcibly relocate people, which was one of the big causes of the famine in the first place. And the share that the rebels get, they use for buying weapons. It's sort of a terrible thing that we desperately want to fix a problem that's outside of our ability to fix.
It is quite depressing that the incentives are completely reversed. So natural disaster preparation, rescue, that all suffers greatly in autocracy because, well, first of all, you have to spend money to build quality buildings and have them inspected and build like the dike that you mentioned. And yeah, the non-essentials, non-cronies, they're the ones who benefit. So you would never do that because it doesn't make sense. Even if you wanted to do that, you'd be ousted. So those people are going to get overlooked. And so emergency planning is not only non-existent or ineffective, it's actually contrary to the interests of the leader and the government to have it in the first place. It's really kind of gross. And democracies have an incentive to plan better. They have to have rescue measures in place because if we don't do this well, the leaders take a lot of shit for it. But here's the problem that just nagging at me, Alastair, is I'm thinking about Hurricane Katrina and how much of a just absolute cluster that was. And our democracy certainly was not prepared for that at all, just at all. And FEMA, that whole thing seemed to be just kind of smoke and mirrors at that point. So I'm going to ask an uncomfortable question and ask you what happened there. I mean, do you think it was because the area was full of poor people? I mean, what other factors might be involved here?
So we should think about, I'd actually sort of prefer to put that in perspective. So around 2,000 people died, and a significant portion of those were very elderly people who had underlying health conditions. So it didn't take, unfortunately, too much to push them over the edge. But that's 2,000. In a country of, 350 million some people. So it's a very small fraction of the population that died. We think FEMA did a terrible job, and I think that was very badly managed, in part because they didn't really want to send relief aid to people who weren't going to vote for downtown New Orleans is not a big Republican stronghold. So they don't want to send a lot of aid. And so it was not badly managed, but in comparison to the scale of disasters in other countries, so that the comparable storm that I like to think of is Cyclone Nargis that hit the Irrawaddy Delta in Myanmar or Burma. That probably killed, well, the official figure's like 138,000, I think, but a lot of people estimate it was over 300,000. And that the government didn't even post any, they withheld weather forecasts. The people tried to leave their flooded villages, and the soldiers drove them back into the villages to drown and die of starvation. In comparison, it's so well done. It's interesting you bring up the FEMA case. So there's some great studies looking at county by county FEMA level of FEMA aid, county by hurricanes. You can measure the wind strength in each of the counties, and you and I would naively think the places with the highest wind speeds would have had the most damage, and on a per capita basis, they would get the most money. And that's partly true. But it also depended nearly as much as on the Republican vote share in that county as it did upon, these were hurricanes back under the first Bush administration, I think. And so even in democracies, we redistribute, but it's very bad form to let lots of people die. I mean, it's also hard. Your supporters, because it's such a large group, your supporters are mingled with opposition people too. So it's hard to isolate people you can let suffer from a storm and people you're going to help. But to the extent you can, that it still happens in democracies. It just doesn't happen as much.
That makes sense. I do hear also from China, you see a lot of flooding in China. I asked my friends who are a couple of China experts, I said, why do we see some massive response in some places in China and some places it just seems like they don't care? And they said, well, that's because that's exactly the case. If you get flooding in coastal Shanghai, they're going to fix that. They're going to repair everything. They're going to build an underwater whatever thing to move the water around. I mean, that is a big deal because you've got a lot of political power concentrated there. Or it doesn't even have to be a big city. Could just be some areas that are more important politically to the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. Other villages, the whole thing washes away, or they have to build a dam that's going to flood the whole thing. And we're not coming to rescue you, figure it out. Look, I don't know, leave or something. And you see the houses are washing away, and those people have no power, so they don't care. They just don't care. And what they do instead is they say, you're not allowed to share a video of this natural disaster from this area because you're spreading rumors, even though it's a video of somebody getting washed away in a flood. They just decide that you can't talk about it. Not that they're going to do anything about it.
Yep, that seems the sad truth. I think you pretty much summed it up nicely. Earthquakes in western provinces of China have terrible responses, and disasters near Beijing and major the coastal place where the elites and the wealth is concentrated, they get fixed with some rapidity.
I want to go back to borrowing. You mentioned that the smaller coalitions have a greater incentive to borrow money. Borrowing, this was something I'd never heard before. I thought was so insightful. Borrowing now, so instead of waiting, right? Borrowing now means any challenger in the future, they just have less credit with which to borrow. So if I'm a dictator and I'm responsible and I say, I don't want to incur debt, I don't want to borrow money, we might need that later, somebody next to me or underneath me could say, I'm going to kill Jordan, and then I'm going to borrow a crap load of money, and I'm going to dole it out to you, and all your organizations. And those people are going to go, you're going to borrow $10 billion and give us each one? All right, I didn't like Jordan that much anyways. So I am now incentivized to borrow as much money as possible. And one, I'm sort of preempting any challenger who would try and screw me over and somebody would come after me. But I also have a bunch of extra money, right? So it looks like from the outside that these autocratic developing world leaders, they just don't understand basic economics. That's what it looks like. But really, it's that they're incentivized to borrow to the hilt and not give a crap about ever paying it back or ever having credit with which to borrow more. It's like screwing up the economy of my country and sacrificing the economic future of the nation. It's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah, no, I think you have it precisely right. So I liked the description I think I find most apt is you take a credit card, you go to the nightclub and throw a party. And only if you're really, really lucky are you going to be the leader still in power long enough to pay back you have to settle the bill. It's like a bill. I run up the check, somebody else pays it. The next guy pays it. So, and it's particular. I mean, that's a problem for all political systems.
I was going to say, it sounds like America.
Yeah. I mean, we see, it's a classic thing that public sector workers have great pension benefits. It's because they're going to be paid by somebody else. I pay them crap today with the expectation they get a big pension, but I'm not paying the pension. So I doesn't have to come out of the pockets of my supporters today. So we see this, but, just to put it in perspective, if you think about how you're willing to magnify debt, if you're trying to reward, if you and I borrow, we think, I borrow the $100 today, is having the $100 to pay back $200 tomorrow. Is that sort of having to pay back twice as much tomorrow? Is it worthwhile? And sometimes we think we borrow and sometimes we think it's not, the returns aren't twice. I'm giving 100% interest because it makes the numbers simple. But now let's suppose you're going to do the same borrowing, but you just have to reward 1% of the population. So, as opposed to everybody, it's on a per capita basis. You could be borrowing on projects that are 1/100th of the value that they would be if you sort of did it on a sort of national incentive basis, because the money's concentrated in the hands of your supporters, but everybody's going to pay it back. And they're going to pay it back in the future when you're unlikely, unless you're super lucky, to be paying. So it's actually staggering to me that that countries don't even borrow even more. It's just, for democracies and everybody, it's staggering to me. And yet we have set up this system of letting people off the hook by debt relief. And so they can just, in a few cases, it helps the economy, but the vast majority of the time, people just start running up the debt again.
Why is it that autocratic countries, they always have water you can't drink or no water, and the electrical grid goes out, there's a blackout, there's a brownout, their roads are not paved? What's going on here? What is this public goods problem that seems to be so prevalent?
Well, you want to have, if you're a dictator, you want to provide public goods to the extent that it makes the workers productive enough. But, putting in water systems is very expensive. Proper sewage, proper water distribution is expensive, particularly the sort of sewage that's particularly, because you have to gravity feeds and everything. So these are expensive things to do. And if the people that benefit from this aren't supporting you and are opposed to you, then you're just wasting your money. You could have kept that money and given it to your cronies. So often these projects aren't done. And often the typical way, some countries, I'm thinking mainly Middle Eastern oil-rich countries, they just have huge amounts of sovereign wealth, which they can actually just reallocate to supporters. But the more general way that you reward people in a small, corrupt system is you just allow your cronies are the ones you license to actually go around and extract bribes. And so you make money through corruption. And what better way to make money than through public works projects? They're built to low standards. Your friends get the bids. We take them away. So the places are corrupt.
Right. Okay. So this makes sense. Right? We want roads, and we want telephone, and we want a little bit of maybe water here and there, but the same infrastructure. But also, I'm giving it to my cronies, so that guy's skimming off the top. So it's built poorly, and it's not really complete to begin with. And I would imagine the same infrastructure that's good for the economy, roads, telephones, internet, they all increase productivity, but wouldn't they also... I mean, that's how we hear about like Twitter being a thing in Iran for the protests. We don't want them to be able to communicate too well or drive to the Capitol in their cars when they're unhappy, right? So I kind of want like just enough that there's a benefit from it, but not enough where they can talk to each other and complain about the fact that everything sucks. Everything else sucks.
So we sort of see more provision of public goods than we might expect in just under political incentives, because they also improve productivity. But yeah, again, we sort of see the public goods that people will provide. Most even corrupt autocracies are willing to provide vaccinations and that basic healthcare, because those things that keep people productive, but doesn't help them organize. But having people freedom of assembly are things that you can take away. In fact, it's actually sort of bizarre, right? It's expensive to not provide freedom of assembly. They pay money to stop people talking to each other.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They had like the Great Firewall of China and the internet policing and the fact that you have so many security officers just in case somebody does gather somewhere. You've got to disperse that all the time. Yeah. Tremendous.
Yeah, it's actually sort of funny, actually, on that. We found out from when the book's published in Chinese, the Dictators Handbook's published in Chinese. And it was only when some scholar wrote to us and said, did you know your book's been, because neither Bruce nor I speak a word of Chinese. So it had to be someone who read both the English version and the Chinese version and then realized, and it was very clumsily edited, apparently. It was just like anytime we mentioned anything in China, it was all just struck out. It just, that paragraph disappeared. And so it doesn't really flow. But again, it's much better just to arbitrarily take it all out than risk. Even if we were saying something nice about somebody, they just took everything that mentioned China disappeared out of the Chinese edition.
It's like they did Control F on the manuscript, search for China, and then just
find
deleted
the leaders'
sentence.
names. Exactly.
Wow.
It was apparently, we didn't realize for years.
Yeah. Why would you?
Right. Because I don't speak Chinese. And
you'd have to do a paragraph by paragraph comparison with somebody who speaks well enough, almost natively in both languages.
Yeah, somebody did. So I say some scholar had done this when he realized that there was stuff missing he'd read in the English
interesting.
copy. Anyway, I thought it was, again, clumsy, but effective, right?
Right. Well, that's there's probably a lot of people whose job it is to take every book that's going to be published in mainland China and do that exact same thing. And maybe they've got a high workload, and that's why it was so clumsy.
Yeah, right. Just easier to take everything out rather than risk letting something through the censors that the censor says you should have taken this out. And you're sitting there thinking, but this is great things about China.
Yeah.
But you left it in, and somebody else. Anyway, play on the safe side.
It's just really. It's so, these little details are always so interesting. And speaking of which, you have this factoid in the book, and I'm not even sure I understood it properly, but is it autocratic countries in general have more twisty roads than, or is it the opposite than democracies? Sorry.
Well, it's the twisty roads. So if you can just decide you want a road from your capital to the airport, which is a great thing to have, because then when things go south, you can get in your armored car, drive to your helicopter, and take the nation's wealth with you. You can just build it. You don't have to care about anybody's obligations. If you want to build a network from New York City to bring people into Manhattan, which, oh God, they do need so badly, it's so much harder to do that. So very simply, just for a funny thing, we just sort of took what's the crow flies distance between the center of the capital and the airport, and how long would it take you and how long do you have to drive? And it turns out dictatorships, they have shorter roads to the airport from the center of the city.
Huh.
I mean, they're just straighter, much more direct. We try and illustrate the arguments in as many contexts as we can. And that was just something we were sitting there complaining about the airport. And, it's so much easier when you're in X, Y, and Z. And then we're like, well, maybe that's general. And it wasn't, it's not hard. You just look up capitals and you measure some distances on Google Earth, and then put the directions in on Google and find out how long it's going to take you to do the journey.
There's this concept in the book that it's better to have incompetent, loyal supporters than it is to have educated, competent people near you who might challenge your power. And I thought this was a really insightful and interesting, but also so obviously destructive, right? Because you got Saddam Hussein, for example, purges all the educated, accomplished people that he can find, basically, and then promotes this guy, Chemical Ali, who I think was like a motorcycle courier. And that guy, I mean, he's probably got like 5 brains. I mean, he wasn't exactly the sharpest guy. We saw him on TV a lot. You just don't want trusted advisors that could reach the top spot. You want trusted advisors that could never reach the top spot. And sometimes that means that they are dullards and or misfits in some other way. That seems like a really dangerous group of people to have around you when you're trying to run a whole country.
Yeah, but again, you're making this fallacy that we probably make in the West all the time, that you're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to promote the welfare of the people. Saddam Hussein was trying to promote the welfare of Saddam Hussein, staying in power, stealing money, building luxury palaces for himself. He was not focused on fixing problems for the poor people. And this is a big problem, and this is a problem a lot of people face in small coalition systems. Is you don't want to let people around you have too much power. And we've seen some really elaborate systems. In fact, it was funny, you were saying earlier that you were working in Serbia, and one reason you might not have been a threat to your boss, is you would be very hard to gain any position of power because you're an outsider. Well, we see this, like Saddam Hussein's number two was, I'm blanking on the guy's name, he was a Christian. So he would have unlikely to have been able to take over. We see even more interesting examples, like eunuchs are the perfect example of people who couldn't possibly be emperor or king or whatever the role is, because they're in some sense spoiled and they can't have a dynastic succession. So they're the perfect people to give important positions of power because they're very much beholden to you. And so we see quite a few innovative ways of allowing some modicum of competence set against this problem that you point out, is that it's better to have loyal people than it is to have competent people.
So to clarify, Saddam's right-hand man was a Christian, and he couldn't ever challenge him because Iraq was Islamic, essentially. Is that
Yeah,
why?
I think it would be much harder for him to build a coalition that would be a successful transition.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Why do dictators go through the whole rigmarole of having rigged elections where they end up with 99.7% of the vote? Why bother with that? I mean, even North Korea has it. And it's just like, what is the freaking point?
So earlier you read out our sort of 5 basic rules, and I'm forgetting which one. I think it must be number 2. The pool of people from which you can pick political supporters, make it as large as possible. So what better than letting everyone potentially vote? But it really matters who you get to count the votes, not how the people voted. So you have corrupt electoral rules, but there's no qualification to be a member of the political elite. You don't have to be from a religious order, or you don't have to be. Hunters actually have quite short leader survival because the replacement pool of senior militaries is very small. And so people don't have to be as loyal, because the next guy's got a good chance they're going to need your support too, because there's not a lot of replacements. But in China, you can there's a very, very small chance of anybody rising to being a political elite. So there's lots of competition for the job. So people are very loyal. That's the sort of genius, I think, of Stalin, is not Stalin, Lenin, just putting this system in place where you increase the replacement pool, and that makes it more risky to be disloyal. So that's the logic, I think, about doing this. I mean, people keep telling me it's about legitimacy and stuff. It's like I don't find those arguments. I just think it's the institutional structure.
I think that makes sense. Hey, there's nothing better than a rigged election as long as you are the one doing the rigging.
So yeah, exactly.
Right. It makes perfect sense when you explain it that way. I would love to talk a little bit about what you think is going on with Russia and Ukraine. I know this is a dramatic departure from dictatorships, but also not, because only a dictator would really well, I shouldn't say that. We've been in our own messes. Usually dictators get themselves into this kind of crap, and this really does seem like Putin stepped in it, and it was just so avoidable.
Yeah, I think that one of the advantages of being a dictator is you can make a lot of policy decisions that are based very much on discretion, something that you want to do. You have slack in the system, and so you can invade. I think the more interesting, revealing part of that conflict is how poorly the Russian military is done. I had just assumed it was 10 times larger than the Ukrainian military, and so it would walk over. But we've just seen very much how dictators fight wars. In the general problem is they're much more interested in private goods, corruption for their cronies, and military spending it's a way of enriching supporters. You think of how you're going to spend the money you've given to the military. You could spend it on fine wines and filet mignons in the officers' club, or you could spend it on training and good equipment for the soldiers. Now, if you want to win a war, option B is very good. But if you want to buy political support, which is number one, then giving the money, letting senior officers, senior people in the military industrial complex steal the funds and produce shoddy materials is a very successful way to do it. And so we often see lots of times where large coalition systems, democracies, and I'm not really going to claim Ukraine's the greatest democracy on that regard, but more so than Russia, how they've often outfought much bigger enemies. I mean, the cases we can look at is Israel always seems to have pulled it out against massive odds against the Arab states that have invaded it. Or sometimes they preempted. I'm not going to get into the political distinction, but they fought very well for relatively small resources. And the real problem goes is we've seen this in Russia. Putin's prepared to throw raw recruits into the battlefront with poor equipment and no effective secret communications.
Because those people are not really stakeholders, like we talked about earlier in the show. Now it's all clicking, right? Those people don't matter. They live in Novosibirsk or suburbia, whatever, and they're nothing. They're not. And the
more importantly, if you want to build effective military resources, it costs real money. It's sort of a capital investment. Where's that capital going to come from? That's money that's going to come out of your cronies' pockets. And so better to fight the war or fight the war poorly and let it drag on than it is to remove the money from your supporters to improve the war. So this is sort of, Democrats, if you lose a war, you've delivered a very bad policy outcome for the masses of people because it affects everybody in the country. And so you don't have enough money to compensate everyone for losing a war. So you take all the resources you have and you pump them into fighting the war in a really effective way. And so we see the US military is incredibly well trained, incredibly well provisioned. And, when the US needs to, they keep doubling their efforts. Every time we're not succeeding, we think about more resources. We sort of we saw this in Iraq. Bush upped the ante and really reinvested in giving the military the resources to make headway in Iraq during the occupation. It's good public policy to win a war, so spend your money on that. It's a very bad idea to take money out of your supporters' pockets. So, Russia is not throwing good materials and support at the Ukraine because it's not good politics to do so.
Oh, man. That's super depressing because and correct me if I'm wrong, what this sounds like is the incentives are throw human bodies at this problem, but not the resources for those bodies to actually succeed in Ukraine because you can't take money out of your cronies' pockets if you're Putin, but you also can't lose a war. So what you do is you just get as many people thrown into that meat grinder as possible over the long, and hopefully he dies before he has to pay the bill for this war.
Yeah, I think you're missing. You don't have to win the war if you're an autocrat. You can afford to lose a war. In fact, the statistics are one of the reasons we originally started this project was thinking about what's the consequences of winning and losing conflict. So Democrats, even if they win wars, if they have a lot of casualties, it's really bad. You think about the policies of LBJ in Vietnam were let's keep trying harder. We're going to keep putting more in to win this until eventually the decision was it's not worth the sacrifice for this policy that we care about, the domino idea that all of Southeast Asia was falling. But LBJ thought about this, had big meetings. It was well resourced how he was going to spend money. And eventually, it takes a long time. And he was completely out of power. He realized he had no effective way of running in '68, and so he basically said, I can't run for my nomination, and the Democrats were beaten by Nixon. But autocrats can survive losing wars. So think about Saddam Hussein. He lost the first Gulf War, was sort of humiliated. But the key thing was the elite units, the Republican Guard, were kept safe at home, living the life of luxury while it was raw recruits out in the desert getting killed. You can afford to lose so long as you don't blow the resources and make your coalition worse off. So it was eventually the US that took him out, not the Iraqi people. He was not deposed internally, he was deposed externally. And so it's much easier to lose a war if you're a small coalition dictator, provided that you keep the resources. There was a horrific war between Iran and Iraq where tons of people got killed. Saddam Hussein and the Ayatollahs, they all kept their jobs. It's not winning or losing that's really important. It's about not squandering resources. For a Democrat, you got to win.
I see.
Which is really interesting idea. This Democrats don't fight each other very often because it's really hard for both sides to have confidence that they're going to win because both sides are going to try hard. So if they happen, they'd probably be, and they're between like comparable sized countries, they're probably going to be bloody, horribly costly financially and in terms of human life affairs, which of course why we don't fight those wars in the first place.
Right. The calculations can be done in advance. So then the question then becomes, so if Putin can afford to lose a war as long as he doesn't lose the resources, why is he not just pulling out of Ukraine? This is obviously not going well for him. And he can stay in power if he just bounces and reframes this as some sort of, hey, at least we got our solidified Crimea and the Donbass and denazified them. We're good here. We win. Bye. Mm-hmm. Why didn't he do that? Why is this not happening?
Well, it may well happen. But as we're sort of discussing, the resources he's plowing in there are not really coming at the expense of his political cronies. So the oligarchs that back him are still kept in a fairly high standard. He's actually flush with cash, right? One of the consequences is, the West has made all these great claims about sanctions and financial assets and stealing yachts. But the thing they haven't done is stop buying. The Europeans have not stopped buying Russian gas.
Sure, they can't.
They're desperate to get it at hugely inflated prices. So Putin's actually doing quite well financially. The war, in some sense, is increasing his revenues. So we tend to think about it's going badly on the battlefield, but it's bringing in some resources. He's slowly captured some territory he didn't have before. So things are not as bad as perhaps we think from his perspective. He's not going to up the ante and take money out of supporters' pockets, but he's letting the war drag on, keep the gas price high, keep the oil price high. That might not be such a bad thing for him. So I don't see it ending anytime. I certainly don't see it ending decisively anytime.
That makes sense, right? Because he's not accountable to the guys that are getting shot because they have cardboard armor or no bullets. Those people can't do they can't do anything. But the people that own and run all the oil companies and all these other things, they're fine. And that's all that matters in his regime.
Yeah. And the US response has been to arm Ukraine, and they've been very successful at that. And the Ukrainians have been trying, I'm going to say sort of trying hard. They're dedicating the whole country to the war effort. And Russia, we see that it's basically people from remote areas being thrown into a fight that the country is not mobilized for as a whole. And so that it's sort of it's a really interesting lesson in how people fight very differently. The US, we give the soldiers the best equipment, the best armored vehicles. Autocrats, they just throw the troops in with bad weapons. When we were invading Afghanistan, we needed help from the Northern Alliance. The soldiers didn't have shoes. The US provided shoes and boots and the air cover for the invasion to take place. And then, the US are saying, why won't you march? And it turns out, well, the leaders of the Northern Alliance have taken the shoes and sold them on the market to get cash, right? We tend to think because we were fortunate to grow up in democracies, that militaries are about providing national defense, but they're not. They're not only that, they're a means of providing internal defense from rioters and stuff, but they're not a very tough military opponent. And they're a way of distributing resources to those people you need to keep happy. Again, another sad perspective on the world, but I don't think it's inaccurate.
So your prediction is the war won't end anytime soon. It's certainly not in any decisive way because the incentives just are not there.
Right. The Ukraine can't afford to lose. Zelensky wants to win the war because he's politically dead. If he's defeated, he'll be, and Russia can readily take lots of the southern Black Sea areas. And at the moment, I don't think the increased price of oil and gas is really going to. It's sort of helping Putin, and it's not costing him or his supporters directly.
Oh man, such an unfortunate reality for everyone.
But it's better that we recognize that this is the state of affairs than just sort of say Putin should withdraw because it's killing lots of people, because that's not in his incentives. It may be the morally correct thing to do and good for Russia and the world as a whole, but it may not be good for him. And so we should only think about trying to implement policies that are going to be compatible with leaders' incentives, because otherwise they're not going to go along with these things.
Are there policies that you see that would be compatible with Putin's incentives that would get him out of Ukraine?
That's sort of hard, right? Portraying him as a war criminal certainly doesn't help, I don't think, because it means if things are going south in the Kremlin, he's going to stay and fight it out and prolong the war rather than think of backing down. If he could, take huge amounts of wealth and go live in luxury and free from protection everywhere, that might be an option that he might find realistic, and his supporters might anticipate he might do that, and they'll be disloyal. Branding him a war criminal early in the process means only provides an incentive for him to fight to the very end. He's already committed the crime. Why would you want to stand and be judged? So he's certainly not going to, in some sense, turn himself into Western authorities or back down and leave himself vulnerable.
It's disgusting to think about, but the best thing we can do, it sounds like one of the best things we could do is let him take a couple billion of his dollars, build him a nice set of villas in Switzerland where he can live out the rest of his life in luxury, and say, hey man, you get a get out of jail free card, but you got to get your people out of Ukraine. And that's a nice option for him. Now he has no reason to trust that we would abide by that, unfortunately.
I mean, I have very mixed feelings about things like the International Criminal Courts, because coming to power is often a bloody business if you're an autocratic leader. So you're often guilty of a crime already. The moment you're guilty, all we do is make the landing hard. The leader just stays and fights it out till the very bitter end. And I mean, you'd like to see some justice for victims, but at the same time, do we need another, 50,000 people to get massacred, or in the military to kill more people and oppress more people, just so we can have the satisfaction of maybe locking somebody up for the crimes that they've done?
Right, we're dragging the conflict on for 5 or 10 years, and then because he knows he's going to spend the rest of his life in The Hague.
Yeah, so why would he? Certainly, he's not going to hand himself over or step down in any way where the next leader might well just hand him over, because that would curry favor with the West. So we just made it. I have very mixed feelings about these international criminal courts. I think it's too quick to say this person's bad. I mean, I have severe reservations about whether prosecuting Donald Trump would be a good idea. I mean, it would seem to be a significant amount of evidence against him, but it seems like a terrible precedence to set to go after locking up political leaders.
Yeah, this is a very pragmatic approach, and a lot of people are going to be like, "Are you insane? We have to lock these people up, whether it's Trump or Putin or whoever you want." But it's like, from a very practical perspective, do we want to save the maximum amount of lives? Do we want to set the right precedent for later on in our political system, or the political system of an autocratic regime, whatever it is? And we just have to sort of balance that, because while we might sort of golf clap when Slobodan Milosevic goes to trial in The Hague, did we prolong everything for the next guy who says, well, I'm not going to go through that. I'm just going to kill 10,000 people, and maybe that'll end these protests that are happening. Nope, that didn't work. All right, kill 50,000 people, and maybe that'll do the trick, because the other option is get hung like Saddam Hussein or whatever.
Right, exactly. So yeah, fixing world problems, so long as we're going to recognize sovereignty of other states, is extremely hard. Engineering things from pleading to the good character and doing the right thing of a leader when those actions we're asking them to do is against their political survival just seems crazy. It just seems they're doomed to failure.
Maybe we just say something about the fact that this was recorded on a different day so people on YouTube don't go, why are they wearing different clothes? Did they have a change in the middle of the... Yes, we changed clothes because we needed a fresh pair to do the foreign aid discussion. So, yeah, I would love to talk about the foreign aid. You hinted at it earlier in the show, and I don't even necessarily know where to begin. First of all, like most people, I don't really understand foreign aid, and I know a lot of people don't, because I see comments online like, why are we giving the Taliban $40 million to do gender studies in Afghanistan when we don't have a secure border? And it's like, well, wait a minute. Something's going on with the aid, because countries are, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, we're not that altruistic. Like, maybe we want to promote democracy because it helps people, but also because there's something in it for us. There has to be, because it's billions of dollars. It's not charity, right?
Right. Well, you think of your political leaders. They should be doing what keeps them in power in their country. So US presidents and Congress should be doing things that benefit their constituents, the people who keep them in power in the United States. So any deal that we see, any aid agreement that's being passed from the US to a foreign nation is going to be domestically beneficial. It would be nice to have this altruistic view that presidents, Congress care about people in Ethiopia at some normative level, but making people overseas better off doesn't get them elected. Making people who keep them in power makes them better off. So we should instantly stop thinking of it as charity and start thinking of it as, what is the exchange that we get? So the obvious example for the United States is throughout the Cold War, the US propped up tons of authoritarian regimes because they adopted anti-communist policies. And when the Cold War was over, a lot of aid disappeared to these countries. And so, and similarly for the Russians, when the Cold War was over, they no longer had this interest in pursuing the Cold War. And so funds stopped flowing. So we want to think about why would the US have an interest? And why would the country go along? And the simple truth is that we get policy concessions on the cheap. What welfare can the leader give to her coalition relative to what they can get by buying policy overseas?
It seems like a lot of this foreign aid then would get, if we're talking about authoritarians and the stuff we said previous in the show, why would those authoritarians, let's say in a country that has a famine, why would they go and give that money to the people that need it and not just steal it? And the answer is they do steal it, right? They steal a lot of it and they distribute it to the people that to them matter, like oligarchs and cronies, correct?
Yeah, that's pretty much what I suspect happens a lot. It's always horrifying to think about the great big Live Aid event for famine in Ethiopia, which is an example I often like to talk to my students about. We see these hideous circumstances and we're all like, it just gets you in the heart. And so what do? We hand over huge amounts of money. Some of the money goes to the Ethiopian government, who predominantly use it for forcible relocation, which is part of the reason the famine started. And the other stuff that gets captured by the rebel groups that are fighting the government, instead of buying food, they end up buying weapons. So in some sense, we enable the crisis to continue. And the horrible truth is hundreds of thousands of people died of famine that was avoidable, but it was only avoidable if the government in Ethiopia cared more about feeding the people than suppressing rebel groups. And unfortunately,
right, so
that's the case.
Famine was kind of engineered right, or allowed to happen because it was happening to people who had militias that were maybe fighting the central government. So it wasn't just like, hey, there's no food here. There's no food here because the government doesn't necessarily want to allow or correct for the problem that caused the famine, or maybe they caused the famine in the first place. And so giving aid to the people that really need it is counter to the whole, it's counterproductive for that leader to do that, because the point is that area is unstable and gives an excuse for them to invade without resistance. Is it my kind of...
Yeah, I mean, I think you sort of hit some major points there. Very much in Ethiopia, the famine weakened the rebels. So it was in the government's incentives to allow the famine to continue. And that wasn't just the Derg, Haile Selassie, benign. He just sort of, why would I spend my money saving people? People have always died of famine. It's the way of the world. Other places where it's extremely, Zimbabwe, after sort of end of white rule, there were sort of two key power groups. And, the prime minister went on to be president. The other group that were threatening him, he just basically engineered a famine. Explicitly just, the people will eventually stop supporting the rebels when they're so starving. And, thousands of people died of starvation, but it achieved the objective of weakening the opposition. And that's one of the sad things. Famines, they're very avoidable. The pharaohs in Egypt knew how to do this thousands of years ago. The technology's not hard. You store some food, and then you redistribute it at hard times, and now you can buy food aid and redistribute it. It's the technology is existed, but yet famines persist. So the question is, somebody allowed them to happen, and that's typically the government.
So it sounds like the sort of key message here is that aid is for the country that provides it. So the Cold War aid kept nations away from the Soviets or with the Soviets, depending on who was giving the aid. And then we ditched those people when that ended, a lot of them anyway. And also explains why we get in bed with bastards who embezzle tons of aid, and even though we know about it. Because it's like, well, yes, that guy's stealing the money. Yes, that guy's killing tons of his people. But at least he's not aligned with the Soviet Union, so we're going to look the other way, which is awful. And it begs the question, does aid do more harm than good?
Well, I'm very much of the opinion that aid is not necessarily a good thing. In fact, I generally think it's a bad thing. That said, I understand why we see pictures of starving children, and we can't help but want to solve this problem. But it wasn't the problem that we really had. If we were going to respect sovereignty of other nations, it's very hard to tell the other guy to do something that's not in their interests, just because it would be better for the people, because the leader isn't doing what's better for the people. They're doing what's best for them. That's how you come to power, particularly when you're beholden to a relatively small group. So there's a real simple logic to the why the US predominantly gives money to sort of poor dictatorial states, because you can buy policy very cheap. So I always like to do a very simple back of the envelope calculation. Suppose the policy that we ask of another nation, the people in that nation, they hate it, and I'm just going to keep numbers simple. So if they would take $1 to be bought off for adopting this policy, and let's suppose each person in the US values the policy change for $1. Just make things like anti-communist, the US like that. The people in the country might not like that. So just think of the dollar exchange. Let's suppose the leader in a foreign country has to keep 10 people happy. So how much do you have to give that leader to make their supporters whole? Well, you have to give them, each of them has to be paid $1. That's $10. The US, the coalition is millions of people in size, tens of millions of people in size. So think of the value of money. We spend 10, but everybody in the country gets something equivalent to $1, but tens of millions of people are getting this benefit. And so we want to transfer money to poor because the money goes further, autocratic countries because you don't have to buy off many people. The average person in the recipient country is worse off. They now have a policy they don't like, but none of the rewards that could be bought with the aid money actually go to them. And so we see evidence that countries that get really high levels of US aid dislike the United States. Yet at the same time, if you look at the other survey data, you ask them, which country would you like to move to? They want to move to the United States, right? It's simple when you think of the incentives. The US provides tons of public goods and services and protection and law and order, clean water, all the things that we take for granted. That's not provided for them in their country, but they're getting policies they really hate because the US are paying for it. So they hate the US, love to move there. And to me, it's sort of a damning indictment that the more age you get, the less you like the United States.
It's interesting because there's a meme that goes around in some of these like anti-communist Chinese Communist Party forums where you see these guys, we call them tankies, that are just like, yeah, you know, America sucks and China's great, it's the greatest thing. And then on another post that they made 3 days earlier, it's like, how do I get my parents into the United States? I've been here as a student for 10 years. I want to move my parents here eventually. What do I need to start doing now? And it's like, didn't you just post about how you love China and it's great and you hate America, but you live here and you want to move your parents here because they're retired now? And it's like they will just lose. They have a meltdown when you call this out, because the uncomfortable truth is they're full of shit, right? But also we're pissing them off with other things. That has nothing to do with aid, but it's kind of the same hypocrisy. And it leads to my question, why we give so much aid to Pakistan. I think a lot of people go, wait a minute, this is the country where they're protesting and burning American flags, and we gave them how much money? And then we find out that they're fighting against us in Afghanistan?
Yeah, this is the real problem. So following the US invasion of Afghanistan 20 plus years ago now, the US needed the Pakistan government to hold down the Taliban activities in the sort of wild borderlands between two countries. And Pakistan wouldn't do that because it was the right thing to do. They did it because they were given a lot of money. And so you just see this tension of to and froing. So the US start ratcheting back the amount of money, and the Pakistan government allow the Taliban more freedoms. And so the US demand that they do more, and the Pakistan put their hand out for more. But they do just enough to keep, just enough that it's worthwhile for the US, because the US does not want American servicemen being killed in Afghanistan because the Taliban have free range in Pakistan. So the US are getting something valuable, and the Pakistanis are just on that sweet spot of they'll do just enough to keep the aid flow, but they'll never take care of the problem. And so the extreme example, I think, of this was, I think we paid around $8 billion to Pakistan to hunt down Osama bin Laden. And where's he found? He's found living in a complex about 1 kilometer from the military defense training school. And we have to believe that the government had absolutely no idea he was there. But, you know, if they found him, why would the US have any incentive to continue to pay them? And so they just, you know, we pay them and they pretend to look. And it's the really sad thing is this incentive is, we're going to pay you to fix the problem that if you actually fixed, we wouldn't pay you anymore.
Right.
And you know, I sort of think, you know, we need an international escrow bank where we could say, you know, there's $12 billion. In fact, we don't even have to say we're going to give it to the Pakistan government. Why go through that pretense? We'll just give it to the president as soon as Osama bin Laden is handed over. And that would just be much more efficient, because Osama gets handed over and the Pakistani leader gets the money he wants. And you know, in some sense, the US would have paid the same, but they would have actually got the job, that they have actually got what they wanted done. So I think we should stop thinking about paying people to fix problems and pay them when the job's completed. You know, we don't just pay our contractor to build us a house and then, you know, when they didn't build it, we just give them some more money. You know, we put the money aside and we'll pay you when the job's done. So that's much more, I think, a practical way. I mean, there are limitations because we have to have credible commitment that the US would pay after the job was done. But that structures the incentives, at least, to get things done. The US want the job done, so they're going to pay, but pay when it's done rather than just pay in the expectation that it will get done.
Yeah, I remember when we went in with the special forces to kill bin Laden, and they were like, our sovereignty. And I was thinking, no, your gravy train got cut off. That's what you're really upset about. I mean, I'm sure it's a little embarrassing that we flew in there under your nose and got this done. But what really sucks is now all these cronies who are getting $1 billion or whatever it is per year we don't have any reason to give you that anymore. We got what we wanted because we went in and finally took it, and that was the problem. The escrow thing, I like the idea, but how does the target nation get the money to do the thing that they need the aid to do if it only comes after they achieve the goal? Like, I get it as a reward for Osama bin Laden, but what if they need to build schools in every part of the rural area in the country and they need 1,000 of them? How do they get the money to do that if they don't have any money?
Well, one of the simple answers would be spend less of the money on corruption and more of the money on generating public policy.
Don't be ridiculous, Alastair. Spend less money on corruption? Come on.
Okay, I mean, maybe you want to do these things in small parcels, so it's as opposed to ask people to do billions and billions of dollars of investment, but you can just do it. We'll do it on a smaller scale. I just think we should at least start by fixing the political incentives and then worry about the technical details of how to get this done. But it's an easy response as well. They can't afford to do it. Well, they can afford to allow corrupt officials to build palaces and mansions and estates and whatever else. So why is it okay for us to give money that is going to end up subsidizing the building of cronies' estates and as opposed to pay them at the end? And if they're not willing to cut down on the corruption, why would we give them money? We should just walk away because they're not going to actually follow through. And if they're not going to do it in order to get the money, they're certainly not going to do it after we've already given them the money. Yeah. So in some sense, it's a way of finding out who's serious about trying to improve the country. And if they're not willing, then the best thing you can do is probably walk away.
Yeah, it's kind of like when a business treats you really poorly while you're trying to get something from them, and you think, man, if this is your customer service before you have my money, imagine what the customer service is like after you have my money. I'm always thinking about that.
Right.
It's got to be quite similar.
We want to find out who's serious about making the world better for people and who isn't. And if they're not serious, then the really sad thing is there's not much we can do unless we're willing to go in and use military force, which I think in general we're reluctant to do, except in extreme cases.
What about the aid we're giving to Ukraine? That's something that a lot of people are complaining about right now. But when I look at discussions online, it's the sort of real politic is we're having Russia, which is right now, unfortunately, the truth is they're a geopolitical enemy because of Putin. We're having them sort of skewer themselves / commit demographic suicide at a rapid rate for a song, where NATO boots are not on the ground. And if the conspiracy theorists want to say that they are, fine, but it's maybe a few hundred people in Ukraine training people. We don't have thousands of guys dying. We don't have our Navy deployed over there. We're really just giving them enough rope to hang themselves. And even though it sounds like a lot of money, because it is objectively, it's a lot cheaper than going to war with Russia. How close am I?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. We get to basically stick it to Russia, and we get to do it for pennies on the dollar. There's undoubtedly, I'm assuming there's tons of NATO and US military advisors over there training people to use the weapon systems because they're pretty high tech. And, they weren't, the Ukrainian army is a lot of recent volunteers, so they don't have the training to use it. So there are people doing that, but yeah, when there's not tons of Americans being killed, and it's weakening Russia militarily. The alternative, of course, the US might not have wanted the war in the first place, but the alternative is to desert the Ukraine and allow the Russians to take over the Black Sea coastal areas and perhaps the whole of the Ukraine. And given the alternatives, we can prop up the Ukraine for tens of billions of dollars. It seems a pretty cheap price to pay.
Right, because pushing the Russians out one is probably impossible, but two would be way more costly in blood and treasure if we decided to do it than to just let the Ukrainians defend themselves for X billion dollars.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much how the whole of the Cold War was fought. We call it the Cold War because there were no large-scale conflicts between the major powers, but it would be naive to think that there was no conflict. Everybody fought proxies. The US sponsored right-wing rebels against communist governments, and they backed right-wing governments against communist rebels, each time trying to weaken the other side. And, it turned out, I think Reagan was not totally wrong when he just basically, we can bankrupt them because we just have much more money than them.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't, their economy was in a mess, years of demand economy, sort of centralized demand economy, and they were just a weak economy, and he just drove them into bankruptcy. You can't continue to spend at the rate we can spend. That's I think we like to think of proxy wars are cheap to fight.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier about how democracies don't like people to die. They much sooner capitalize their army, whereas autocracies are much more likely to use labor, but not to capitalize, because capitalizing the military means taking money out of your cronies' pockets. Well, the per capita cost of funding the Ukraine is, maybe a couple of $100 per taxpayer in the United States, which to many would be much better than having people in their neighborhood and towns being killed in the war.
Right.
Vietnam was very unpopular. Mm-hmm. Much better, and in most cases, the US took the policy of paying somebody else to be the boots on the ground, and they provide the capital and intelligence and equipment. And you sort of saw what happened when you start ramping up the labor costs for fighting the Vietnam War, for example.
That's what this seems like to me. It seems like Russia's Vietnam. I know that was at their Afghanistan, but maybe the U.S. and Russia are both really slow in learning these lessons, because Russia is spending blood and lives right now. They have a lot of money because they have these natural resources. Europe's still buying oil from them, whatever. But we don't have to spend our lives. We just have to spend our cash. So we put in $100 and they lose a soldier. We can do that probably longer than they can. And that's the bet that everybody's making right now, right? Is that they're going to run out of guys that they can throw into the meat grinder before we run out of cash from the alliance that's funding these weapon systems going to Ukraine.
I mean, the really sad thing is you can go pretty deep into the population. I mean, we think of Vietnam and the terrible casualty figures for the United States, but let's think of it from the North Vietnamese perspective. The casualty figures, I don't know the exact kill ratios, but you've got to think at least 10 to 1 for every American that was killed. Many, many North Vietnamese were killed, and yet they could continue to do that, basically till the US would no long chose. I think I guess there is at some limit where there are no more people you can draft, but we are nowhere near that barrier. It's usually a political willingness to throw people into battle. There's a lot of people in Russia.
That's true. They're having a demographic crisis, but that's a topic for a different show, I think. I know you are short on time, but I want to end with this, because I think a lot of people are wondering, why don't people revolt more in autocratic societies? I mean, yes, the consequences of doing so anywhere are pretty harsh. Prison or death. If you try to overthrow the U.S. government, well, I guess we're seeing a little bit of that. But if we really saw an armed insurrection, you're looking at serious prison. You're looking at getting killed in the process or killed afterwards, right? Is that the only reason, though? Because if it is, I just can't believe it's the only reason. Because a lot of these people are living pretty crappy lives, like North Koreans. I mean, they really are.
Right. So, you want to think about what the government does for you. So in a democratic society, most of us, we go on the streets and protest because we don't like policy, but very few of us want to overturn the American system of government. We don't want to get rid of elections. And we like the system that we have. We just don't like the policies, but we can protest freely. We have no desire to overturn it because there's lots of public goods. There's safety, clean water, roads, communications. We can all gripe about it, but it's a hell of a lot better than in many other parts of the world. Take the other extreme that you just mentioned, North Korea, where leaders are beholden to tens or thousands of people, but very small numbers. Those systems are really hard to overcome because they tend to be hierarchically structured. If you don't enforce discipline on the group of people you're responsible for, your superiors are going to have incentives to enforce discipline on you. And remote villages just cannot, in North Korea, it's almost impossible to know what's going on in the next village over. So the chances of you getting sufficiently large numbers of people to all spontaneously arrive at the same place to challenge the government which has modern military weapons, it's extremely hard to overthrow North Korea. The interesting place is, so we got two extremes. Democracy, nobody really wants to overthrow the institutions. At most autocratic systems, nobody really can overthrow they don't have the capacity to get together and organize it. So it's in the middle ground that we find, the places like Tunisia and Egypt, where we saw there's some elements of democracy, people can talk a bit. And again, it tends to be when the government's particularly weak. Maybe the leader is very old. Maybe the leader is having a financial problem, so they're having trouble paying people. At which point, as soon as we see the coalition wavering in their support, that's the time people can come to the streets. They're going to come to the streets when the elites are not going to put them down. So basically, I mean, it's really hard to think of revolutions that have succeeded when the elites decided that they weren't going to succeed. Maybe the American Revolution, that was, but the French Revolution. Why? Because the military allowed the people to rise up. They stopped shooting them. The same in the Philippines. The same in Iran against the Shah. In nearly all cases, it's because the military chose to allow the elites allowed the people to rise up. So, people don't want to go on the streets and get shot. There are a few extremists who believe it's always right. And unfortunately, those people suffer terribly. But it's really hard to get enough momentum to get enough people over on the streets that it's going to win. So this is why things tend to fall apart quite quickly, like the end of the Soviet Eastern Bloc all happened very quickly because you need this sort of radical change in beliefs that a regime you could possibly win. And then everybody's sitting there thinking, I'd love some change. And you suddenly see this sort of dominoes. One goes, the next goes, and we see all these countries falling because you suddenly realize, well, maybe the army won't shoot at us if we go out on the street. It's just very hard to get everyone, when they're allowed to talk to each other, coordinate. It's sad, but nearly all leaders are brought down through the rules of the system, or they're brought down by the elites. The times when the revolutionaries win are very small. Very few examples of leaders being deposed by the masses, and it's because the elites allow it to happen.
Interesting. So that we basically have to wait for the ruling coalition to step back and allow that sort of thing to happen. Otherwise, it just doesn't. And that explains the stability of some regimes over others.
Right. Yeah, and it's all the actions in the middle. It's rare that the smallest winning coalition systems, the North Koreas of the world, have it. Democracies, we have a lot of protests and often violent demonstrations, but nobody really wants to overturn the system completely. And so it's in the middle where you want to change the system and you have enough freedoms that you can get away from doing it. So that's sort of the message, I guess, is that we're going to see the successful revolutions in the middle between those two extremes. It's this combination of ability and want, and they run in opposite directions.
Alastair, thank you so much. This is really, really interesting. And hopefully we're going to see, one, I understand foreign aid and the sort of the power system of autocratic regimes and democracies a lot better, but hopefully we're going to see some of this play out in the next decade for sure, certainly with the West and Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it's really kind of a little bit of a glimpse into the matrix of why these regimes last as long as they do and how they gain stability. So I really appreciate your expertise here. Thanks for coming on the show. Yeah,
I sort of wish I was wrong because my sort of view is very pessimistic. But it's better to understand, if you want to fix a problem, it's better to understand the workings of the system that you're trying to fix, as opposed to just, the rose-tinted glasses is not going to solve any problems. And just thinking that people want to do the right thing is not going to be helpful. So, pessimistic, but I unfortunately think accurate.
Yeah, but practical, right? I mean, that's the thing with that struck me about the aid conversation is, okay, we just have to admit that this is not to help people who are starving. It's to get rid of this thing that's happening. Or yes, it is to help people that are starving, but in order to do that, we just got to bribe this son of a bitch and be okay with it and not pretend like we're not doing that or that we shouldn't be doing that. That's how it works over there. Just suck it up and do it. And unfortunately, that seems like the truth. And there's some stuff I'm going to say in the show close about oil companies working in these countries where they're not allowed to bribe people or engage in corruption. And it's like, well, fine, we'll leave. And then some French company's going to go in there and say, we don't have laws against that. I mean, they do, but another country's company will go in there and say, we don't have laws against this. And they're just going to take the business. That's just how it is.
The oil companies are great because you don't need, you're a dictator, you have a foreign oil company come in, they just pump the oil out the ground, give you a share of it. You don't have to have engagement from very little of your population is involved. It's this sort of perfect collusion. If the people had to work, then you'd have to let them talk. But since, the oil company's giving you the money, you don't have to let the people talk. So it's good for you. There's a really interesting debate here. I actually think that sort of US oil companies are actually a little more pro-reform than we might have just naively expected because they don't want to be burdened by regulations. But it's much harder for US companies to bribe foreign governments than it is for, let's say, a Saudi company. Or I don't want to name names, but an American oil company is going to have some serious accounting, so it's very difficult for them to actually bribe. So they're actually comparatively disadvantaged in the corrupt system because they can't pay the bribes. They can probably more efficiently pump the oil, but it's harder for them to pay the bribes because they're going to be monitored from the US side. And so reforming the system to make the system more democratic, more accountable. They don't like the rules under which they have to operate, but at least it levels the playing field relative to the other companies that find it more easy to put bribes in people's pockets.
Thanks for checking out this entire episode of The Jordan Harbinger Show. If you're interested in exploring this topic further, check out the Jordan Harbinger Show podcast feed. There, we dive even deeper on this and many other topics. In the audio podcast, I also close open loops, cover things discussed off camera, off air, and give some parting lessons from our guest. You can find The Jordan Harbinger Show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any podcast app, or at jordanharbinger.com. And also, if you found this episode useful, please share it with those you care about. Last but not least, like, comment, and subscribe.